The island of Saint-Domingue had once been called paradise. Its shores shone like polished gold, and the warm winds carried the scent of sugarcane across the hills. But paradise had a shadow built from chains, whips, and silent suffering. For on this island, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans had been forced to work under the burning sun. Their backs had bent, their voices had been silenced, their tears had fallen quietly into the soil that enriched the empire. Among them, a child was born, a child whose life was supposed to be carved by bondage. His name was Toussaint. He had been small and fragile in his youth, yet there was something unusual in his eyes, a depth, a watchfulness, as if he saw the world not only as it was, but as it could be. He watched the overseers shout and punish. He heard the whispers of rebellion carried by the wind. He listened to the old men speak of kingdoms far across the ocean, kingdoms where their ancestors had once been free. His father, they said, had been a man of status in Africa before the chains had taken him. Pride still lived in his blood, and Toussaint inherited that pride, quietly, like an ember burning beneath ashes. Unlike many slaves, Toussaint had been taught to read and write. He studied the writings of men who believed in freedom, philosophy, and justice. Books became his first rebellion. Every word he learned was a chain broken inside his mind. As the years passed, he grew wise. He learned to treat the wounds of the sick. He learned how horses moved, how men thought, how leaders inspired. He spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. Because his voice was calm, measured, filled with something that had long been forbidden to those in chains: hope. But hope could not remain quiet forever. The island trembled with tension. The plantations were boiling with rage. The world was changing, and beyond the seas, revolutions were burning in Europe. Freedom was becoming contagious. Toussaint felt the storm before it came. He had been preparing his entire life, not with swords, but with patience, not with hate, but with understanding. The day would soon come when the enslaved would rise, and when that day arrived, they would need a voice, a guide, a leader. The slave who would one day command armies first learned to command himself. The years passed, and Toussaint grew not only in age, but in wisdom. He studied how great leaders thought, not to rule others, but to understand how to guide people. People began to see him differently, not as a worker, but as someone who could lead. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing. Across the ocean, the French Revolution had begun. Ideas of freedom and equality started to spread. Those ideas reached the island like distant thunder. The enslaved people listened. Whispers of freedom passed from field to field. The ground felt ready to break. But Toussaint did not rush. He did not act out of anger. He waited, watched, and prepared. But Toussaint did not rush. He did not act out of anger. He waited, watched, and prepared. He understood one thing: a revolution succeeds not with rage, but with discipline. Saint-Domingue, once known as the richest colony in the Caribbean, had been placed under brutal exploitation. The island's fertile soil and warm climate made it perfect for growing sugar and coffee. European demand for these products had increased rapidly, and France turned the colony into a massive plantation economy. Under the brutal working conditions, many enslaved people had fallen sick and grown weak, while countless others had died, unable to endure the suffering any longer. Seeing this, Toussaint had begun forming the first spark of rebellion in his mind, quietly, patiently, and with purpose. In August 1791, under Toussaint's rising leadership, the first spark of rebellion ignited, a small flame that would soon become a revolution. The uprising had grown, but freedom was not yet won. Great powers came to crush it. First, the French tried to regain control. Then the Spanish came, hoping to claim the colony. And soon, the British landed with ships and soldiers, believing they could take the island for themselves. 3 empires, 1 small rebel army of former slaves, but they had Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint studied every movement of his enemies. He learned how their armies marched, how they planned, how they reacted. He knew the mountains, the forests, the rivers. He used the land as if it were a weapon in his hands. He knew the mountains, the forests, the rivers. He used the land as if it were a weapon in his hands. His soldiers moved quickly, striking hard and disappearing into the hills before the enemy could respond. This was a new kind of warfare. Not strength against strength, but intelligence against empire. Piece by piece, victory began to favor the rebels. And then at last, the British withdrew. The Spanish surrendered. The French were forced to negotiate. The world had to accept something it never expected. An army of former slaves had defeated the armies of empires. But Toussaint did not celebrate. He knew the struggle was not truly over. Freedom won in battle must be protected in peace. The war had ended. The island was damaged, but it was free. Toussaint Louverture now faced a new task: to rebuild a nation. He did not rule with anger. He did not seek revenge. He believed that freedom needed order and discipline. He reopened the farm so people could have food. He repaired roads and towns so life could continue. He encouraged trade so families could rebuild their homes. He supported education. He believed that if people could read and think, they would never be enslaved again. Most importantly, he ended slavery forever on the island. To protect this freedom, he wrote a new constitution. The constitution said, "The island governed itself. All people were equal. No one could ever be a slave again." For a short time, it seemed like the dream of freedom had finally become real. But across the ocean, Napoleon Bonaparte watched, and he did not accept that former slaves had built a free nation. A new threat was coming. Napoleon had watched the island from across the sea. He had seen that Toussaint Louverture had built a free black nation, and he hated it. He believed that no former slave had the right to rule. He wanted the colony back. He wanted slavery to return. So he sent a great fleet of ships to the island. They arrived with soldiers, cannons, and orders of deception. They told Toussaint they came to talk. They promised peace. They spoke of negotiation and respect. But it was a trap. Toussaint had fallen into a trap in the peace talks she had gone to alone. Toussaint had met them with honor, but they had taken him by force. No trial, no defense, no justice. He was placed in chains once again, not as a slave of the fields, but as a prisoner of an empire. They transported him across the ocean, far from his home, to a cold stone fortress in the mountains of France. The walls were damp, the air was thin, snow covered the land outside. He had led armies, he had defeated empires, but in that cell, his body grew weak, yet his spirit did not break. Before his final breath, he spoke to the guard. "You have cut down the tree of liberty, but the roots remain. They will grow again." And he was right. 1 year later, his people rose again. They continued the fight he had begun. And in 1804, Haiti became the first free black republic in the world, the first nation where slavery was destroyed by those who had endured it. Toussaint did not live to see the victory, but the victory carried his name. His legacy was not carved in stone, but in freedom itself.